So yesterday, we covered Friday the 13th. That film was a fairly solid standalone whodunit slasher where everything wrapped up nicely. Our killer, the vengeful Pamela Voorhees, is decapitated, and our final girl Alice lived to see another day, but not before a fun little scare. The movie ended with Alice floating peacefully on a boat, only for Pamela's drowned son, who died decades ago, to shockingly emerge from the water and pull her under in an iconic final fright. Not in the original script, this moment was added during production at the suggestion of legendary makeup artist Tom Savini, who had just seen the 1976 movie Carrie and felt inspired by that film's big final jump scare, as Carrie's arm emerges from the rubble in another character's nightmare. Originally, Alice was just supposed to float on the boat after the hell she'd been through, and then the credits would roll. But Tom thought the film would benefit from a nice little closing bite. The rest of the crew agreed, and we had this iconic moment. But don't worry, it's all just a dream. We've already established that Jason died decades ago. This is just an effective bit of punch to send audiences home with. Nothing more. It would be super weird to make like 11 more movies off the back of this little last minute jump scare that wasn't even part of the original script, wouldn't it? They wouldn't do that, right? Right? Oh. Friday the 13th Part 2 initially takes place 2 months after the events of the first film. Alice, our only survivor from that movie's events, is still haunted by the trauma of having to slay her attempted murderer Mrs. Voorhees, and we open on her tossing and turning to her nightmares, making her relive the event once more, complete with actual footage from the first film. Some might say this is a good way of recapping the audiences. Others might say it's a cheap way to pad time by recycling existing footage. You be the judge. Unable to sleep, Alice wanders round her home for a bit, only to be greeted by the rotting head of the woman from her nightmares when she opens her fridge. Before she even has a chance to flee the scene, she is immediately killed by an unseen attacker with an ice pick, before we even get to the film's title screen. Oh boy, do I hate that. More on why later though. I'll finish my plot summary first, but don't worry, we'll get to it. Fast forward to 5 years later, and a school for camp counsellors has been set up right by Crystal Lake, the same place Pamela Voorhees committed her wicked murders, which are now the stuff of urban legend. One night around a campfire, the school host Paul tells his trainee counsellors of the story of Pamela, her killings for her son and her decapitation. But there's more to the story than the audience of that first film's events know apparently, because you see, legend has it that Jason, Pamela's son, actually survived, and is now living in the woods nearby, killing all who set foot on the land as vengeance for his deceased mother. But don't worry, it's just a legend. Oh no, wait, look, everyone's dying. Very quickly, the counsellors begin to drop like flies once more, dispatched in an even more violent manner than the last time. Once again, it's by an unknown assailant. We don't get to see who the killer is for a little while, and the whole thing is structured as another whodunit. But come the fuck on, movie. It is obviously Jason. That is genuinely the only possible person it could be. Literally, who the hell else could it be? I get that they tried to stick to what worked with the first film, but that movie's whodunit structure only worked because the murderer was actually someone unexpected. And you also had no real idea who it could be as you watched the film unfold. But this time round, who the fuck else could be the murderer? You've basically got 3 possible answers. It's either Jason, which, yes, obviously it is. It's maybe Jason's dad, I guess, if you want to repeat the mother twist of the first film to significantly worse effect. Or it's someone else completely, totally unrelated to the Voorhees plot. But imagine that was the case. How unsatisfying would that be? You spend the whole film wondering who the killer is, pretty confident that it's Jason, and then at the last minute the film turns around and goes, nah, it's just Barry from down the road, innit? Yeah, lad who buys his milk at the corner shop there. Yeah, I know, who knew he had it in him? So yeah, obviously, the killer is Jason. Albeit still not the Jason you know. Once again, there's no hockey mask in sight, and instead this Jason goes for a little burlap sack number with a single eye hole cut so he can see. Regardless of his appearance though, Jason does exactly what you'd expect Jason to do, and proceeds to pick off our camp counsellors one by one until only camp host Paul and his assistant, this film's final girl Ginny, who is really great by the way, survive his attacks for one final showdown, outsmart him by having Ginny pretend to be his mother and eventually best him, but not before this film gets a final jump scare of its own. Thankfully, this one didn't also trigger the existence of 10 other movies I have to review. So that's the gist. There's a lot of fun, good stuff in there and some not so good. As already mentioned, I really detest that they kill Alice in the first 5 minutes. I mean, from a purely plot level, it makes Jason's characterization really inconsistent, as he spends most of the film as a dumb brute who's so confused by everything around him that by the end of the film, Ginny is able to survive a little longer by convincing Jason she's his mom. And yet this dude also managed to track down Alice at her home 2 months after his mother died like a private detective. But that's small beans, I don't really care about that. What bothers me is the narrative and thematic suffering that comes from this decision. I know Friday the 13th is a franchise that's not really concerned with those things, and that's sort of part of its charm, but even still, do right by your characters, man. It's really frustrating that they create this sympathetic woman, have her survive traumatic events, only to unceremoniously undo that victory in a matter of minutes. And for what, really? A drawn-out opening scare before the titles? Is it worth it? It doesn't really even play into the events of the rest of the film that are set 5 years later. I just hate it when films do this. Even when I like the films, Nightmare 4 pulled the same bullshit really frustratingly, and so did Alien 3. It just kind of undoes any of the earned catharsis for the characters. Compare this to how Halloween handles its final girl, and whether intentional or not, Laurie sticking around in spite of the multiple attacks makes her story a story of persistence, perseverance, and resilience in the face of terror. You get all your scares in, but you also get this crucial element of humanity for people to latch onto. There's a reason Laurie's story by the time the Halloween reboot/sequel of 2018 comes along is so compelling, and that's because it's a story of survival, of finding strength in the terror. Alice though, she gets to survive, only to be trapped in a nightmare of trauma, and then is cast aside like used chewing gum before the sequel even really starts. Now you might think differently, so I don't mean to sour anyone's sweet here, but in my personal opinion, it's cheap, it's lazy, and it sucks. It also, on a personal level, makes my job a little bit harder because my whole intent with Wholesome Halloween is meant to be to make this cozy show about finding the heart and humanity in horror, even in the places you wouldn't expect it to be. But this is exactly the kind of cynical nihilism that people write off slashers for. Oh, also, while we're talking about grim miserable stuff, there's a dead dog in this film. Thankfully, not a real animal this time, and you don't see it killed. But I figure while we're on the bleak note, I'd warn you all about it, as I know that's a real turn-off for some people. Anyway, those things aside though, the film isn't at all without its fun/merit. The cast of this are actually kinda great. At best in these movies, I'm normally indifferent to the campers, save for maybe the final girl, and at worst, I actively detest them. But here, I actually care about these people. It's wild, right? It helps that they actually act like teenagers this time around. I didn't mention this in the last vid because there wasn't a good time to bring it up, but in the first movie, I found it absolutely hilarious that it opens with the camp counselors sitting in a circle singing traditional religious folk songs. You know, like teenagers do. I must stress, this isn't at the demand of an older adult overseeing them, by the way. They appear to be doing this completely of their own volition. It's farcical. Teens do not do this. The characters of part 2 though are a lot more natural. They pass the time with things like video games and chess and arm wrestling, you know, actual stuff 18 and 19-year-olds might actually do in a camp cabin. They're all characterized pretty nicely too. The stark horny couple who get the typical sex to death scene are pretty forgettable, but the rest of the counselors that fill out the cast are genuinely solidly acted and fun to just watch do their thing. I really like this guy Mark and his love interest Vicky. Mark seems like a genuinely nice guy, and him and Vicky have a believable chemistry and very natural dialogue and flirting. Also, final girl Ginny is brilliant. She has a real personality about her. As head counselor Paul's assistant, she's sarcastic and playful, and as the film goes on, she's smart and resourceful. She's extremely easy to root for, believably human, and far more than just a stock placeholder to act as the last one screaming. Also, I'm a fan of Jason's look in this one. It's not his iconic hockey mask, but I really like its thrown together quality. And the touch of the single eye hole allows the actor Steve Dash, credited as the stuntman as a different actor played the unmasked Jason at the end of the film, to be surprisingly emotive. Also, is it just me, or is it a little bit scarier visually than a hockey mask? A moment that comes to mind is when Vicky goes into the bedroom and you're expecting her to see the corpses of her friends under the sheets, and then Jason just bolts upright from under the covers, his one uncovered eye staring daggers in her direction. It sounds daft, but that eye really communicates his violent intent. And then later on in the final moments of the film, you can see the character's confusion and hesitation when Jenny is pretending to be his mother. It's a strangely good performance for such a minimalistic costume and role. Jason's characterization isn't quite there at this point in the series though. He's not at all the near immortal, unflinching, unrelenting monster he'd become. They're still very much playing him as traditionally human in this film. He can be fought and he's kind of cumbersome in his movement. He certainly doesn't have the kind of physical strength that crush a man's skull with his bare hands. He's even clumsy at times, but there's some unique merit in that too. It makes him less terrifying, but also more grounded. Same with his killing tools, just being this rusty variety of whatever tools he can get his hands on. It gives the film a small level of realism that isn't present in any of the follow-ups. It's a simple slasher at its core, but it's got a fun villain, in spite of the odd plot choices we took to get him to exist. There's some good scares and a really truly great final girl. But I think what's most interesting about Friday the 13th Part 2 though, is that it was never meant to happen. At least not in the way you or I know of it, in its now existing form. Any franchise plans for the series initially had these movies pegged as anthology films. The idea being that if that first film proved to be a hit, each subsequent release would not follow on with that film's story, but rather make a bunch more films in the series with unique original settings, characters and plots, their only relation tying them together being the franchise title and the theme of a curse. What ended up happening, however, is that fan response was so positive to that little surprise Jason appearance at the end of the last film, that instead, Friday the 13th's follow-up, and also every movie in its series thereafter, would expand upon the mythos of that character and Camp Crystal Lake. It certainly turned out to be a profitable decision, but would you say this sequel was actually good as a result of those decisions? Well, kinda. It's hard to say really because it depends on what you define as good. I mean, it's certainly a Friday the 13th movie. A lot of camp counselors die at the hands of famous frightener Jason Voorhees, and you'll probably have a good time watching it. But you know how yesterday I kind of said that what you have to understand with Friday the 13th is that it's all plot, no theme? Like how it's a film that absolutely does not want to engage with its ideas and any interesting subtext feels almost entirely accidental? Well, this sequel doubles down on that. It's a movie that is purely vibes. No thoughts necessary. You might question, for example, how exactly Jason Voorhees, the dead child of the first movie, is now somehow a hulking maniac picking off counselors in place of his mother. Like, does that mean he never died? Is he dead and a zombie? Was he not dead in the first film and his mother was just wrong? Or did his mother's death somehow bring him back? Was he just living at the bottom of the lake or something? Or just like in the area? Why did his mom not know about that? Wait, wasn't the end when he came out in the water all a dream anyway? Does that mean that part wasn't a dream? And if it wasn't, how is he like a child in that first film and now in this one set only 5 years later, he's like a fully grown man built like a professional wrestler? The answer to these questions, of course, is it does not matter. Do not think about this. Just vibe. Just scary vibes only. While it's arguable that the first film has some pretty interesting, if potentially accidental, themes and subtext, this second film, and by extension all of the films that follow on from this first movie, work so hard at being purely plot-based that they don't even manage to really find time to even accidentally say something clever along the way. Famously, Victor Miller, the writer of the first film, is not a fan of the sequels. He apparently gets asked about this so much that his frequently asked questions page on his website has this to say. To be honest, I have not seen any of the sequels, but I have a major problem with all of them, because they made Jason the villain. I still believe that the best part of my screenplay was the fact that a mother figure was the serial killer, working from a horribly twisted desire to avenge the senseless death of her son. Jason was dead from the very beginning. He was a victim, not a villain. Now I find this pretty interesting, as I kind of agree with Miller here in that the most interesting part of that first film script is that the mother was the serial killer. And I do agree with him that it is weird for the Jason character, or at least his version of him, to be rebranded into some monstrous murderer when he was initially just a victim of child neglect. Seeing what the franchise is now, it would be weird to think of the films without a killer Jason. But at the time, I could see this feeling like a really weird step. Plus, I imagine if I had been so close to the project as to write it, I'd probably still think this was a very wrong route to take. So I guess the thing is, Victor Miller isn't at all wrong in what he says. But his writing is for a different franchise. His writing is for the alternate universe one, where the series becomes an anthology, where you can wrap those stories up and leave their bones undisturbed. Critical bashing of the first film aside, it is clear Victor Miller felt a sense of artistic integrity and meaning in that story. And like I said in yesterday's video, although I'm not sure all of the interesting themes were intentional, the female killer was the one bit of the film that felt like something a bit more revolutionary, the part that had the most substance, the thing that had the most to say. And maybe in a different reality, Miller might have penned more of the films in the franchise, and we might have gotten more movies with a greater deal of substance in their theming, accidental or otherwise. The commercial reality though was, fans really liked it when Jason went "Rah!" and came out of the water. And I really like that bit too. I really like villain Jason, so I'm kinda part of the problem. If you even consider it a problem, that is. The first film was mostly the popcorn escapism alternative to the heavy challenging horror of the time, and there was nothing wrong with that then, regardless of what critics might have thought. So in some ways, this nonsense, no-brain, plot hole burning rebranding of Jason from drowned child to hulking madman is kind of very much in keeping with the spirit of the first movie. Get rid of the one thing that had anything interesting to say on a thematic level, simplify the whole thing into even more of a big fun gory slasher, accidentally create one of cinema's biggest bogeymen in the process, and let the profit roll in. Could anything else really be more Friday the 13th? So essentially, to answer the question, is it good? Well, if you're looking for a roller coaster, this is a pretty fun one. If you're looking for something with a bit more substance, you're probably in the wrong franchise. But that's okay, because there's space in cinema for traumatic terror and for popcorn slashers, and plenty of people enjoy both. Overall, it's a great little transitional film. That's a huge step forward in making Friday the 13th the iconic series we know it to be today. It gave us more creative gore, our first glimpse of Jason as a villain, a really great cast with an awesome final girl. Sure, it takes some massive creative liberties with the premises set about by its prior movie, and you could ask a million questions about how Jason's presence here makes any sense, but in the end, it truly doesn't matter. All this movie wants to be is all any Friday the 13th wants to be. A cool escapist scary flick for parties with friends and dark and stormy date nights. And on that level, it totally works. Anyway, that's Friday the 13th Part 2 done and added to the archives. As always, be sure to like, comment with your thoughts, subscribe to my OnlyDance at the red button below, and if you're feeling really supportive, check me out on Patreon for a bunch of perks. More info in the link in the description. And with that, I've been Dan Drambles, you're watching Wholesome Halloween 2 Slasher Season, and I will see you for Friday the 13th Part 3 tomorrow.